Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. This afternoon, we have a great speaker regarding API security shift left. So we're going to bring on stage Christine Bevilacqua from APIsec AI. Welcome, Christine. How are you?
Hi, Mel. Thanks for having me today. I'm great.
Great. She's a head of product marketing and a API security evangelist. So I'm going to leave it to you.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone, for joining me for this talk. Appreciate your time and attention. So really, I'm here today less so on behalf of APIsec corporate and more on behalf of APIsec University. So I'm not sure how many of you caught Corey Ball's closing keynote speech last night, but I know that he put in a little bit of a plug for APIsec University. It's a great free location where API security experts can go and get trained on how to penetration test APIs today. And we're also adding more, more content and more training tools out there for other audience as well. So I'll talk about that a little bit later on in today's presentation. So let's get started. Today I'm talking about how to take the out of shift left security. I know for a lot of us in the security world, as well as a lot of developers out there, the notion of shift left can bring a very visceral reaction. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about how we can break down some of those barriers between security and development, specifically when it comes to APIs, so that we can become better partners with each other in terms of developing secure APIs and hardening those before they ever reach production. So in doing so, we'll talk about why is shift left so important when it comes to APIs. And a lot of that is rooted in what the three different pillars are of API security and how to, create a strong API security program. And then we'll talk about, again, how to break down those barriers between dev and sec on both sides, right? How we can educate and empower each other. On the dev side, how we as security professionals can do a better job of helping them understand what it is that we have to do and how to inherently build secure APIs from the ground up. And on their side, it's helpful for us to better understand how APIs are built, how they function, so that we can do a better job of understanding how to secure them. We'll talk about a few real world successes in various size organizations and in various verticals where they've already shifted a lot of their API security focus to a pre-production or left environment. And then just leave you guys with a couple of best practices of how you can take some of this back to your own organization and hopefully develop those relationships to break down some of those barriers between developers and security. So with that, I'll head forward. So why shift left? You're probably all very familiar with all of these, with all of these statistics. Nothing new here, right? That API security or APIs continue to grow in terms of the sheer volume of traffic that is related to APIs. It is the most frequent attack vector. Not surprisingly, it's also poses the biggest attack surface, right? There's never a shortage of high-profile breaches. I don't see that slowing down anytime soon. But one of the biggest reasons is that there's also regulatory compliance around actually doing our best to test for and harden our APIs against known security vulnerabilities prior to those going live. So, if you're familiar with PCI regulatory requirements, there's some very specific stuff in the next version of PCI that calls out APIs specifically. I know the OCC, has released some guidance on their focus on third-party risk this year. We've got a webinar coming up on APIsec University that'll talk a little bit more in depth about what the financial industry can do to help mitigate third-party risk. And then, just privacy laws as well. So all of these things would indicate that it is better to have security applied to our APIs and harden those before they're in a live environment versus after. And this slide looks like it got a little bit messed up. your problem's not shrinking, right? So we can't just stick our heads in the sand and say, well, hopefully we'll just catch any, intrusions or anomalous activity once it's already live. 93% of all professional developers are using APIs. That's a little bit staggering when you think of how many total developers there are in the world. I did the math for you. That would be almost 22 million developers that are using APIs in enterprise projects today. I won't go through all of these stats, but you can see them, right? So if that many developers are using APIs in the applications that we all consume every day, it would be foolish not to shift our focus on securing those APIs to a pre-production environment. And then depending on who you listen to, I'm sorry, this is the one that got a little messed up. Whether it's, No Names Research or SALT Securities Research, either 76 or 95% of all organizations have experienced an API security incident over the last 12 months. Yet, according to SALT's, they're 95%, 34% of that 95% have no API security strategy at all. That's a little shocking and frightening, I'm sure, to all of us at this conference. And not the least of which is the actual cost that it poses to us as a society, but also to our organizations as well. So I think that there's no shortage of reasons for why we should secure and harden our APIs before introducing known vulnerabilities into a live environment. No surprise to anyone on this call probably is that attackers target APIs because they're easy to attack, right? In many cases, they provide direct access to sensitive data. The way that they've been developed and put out there is that they're often over-permissioned, right? And they're very, very vulnerable, as we all know, to logic flaws. So I'll just leave you with this question. And it's a question that we should all ask ourselves, both on the development side and on the security side, every time we think about API security, right? When do you want to find an API vulnerability? Would you rather find that before something happens or here when your organization is suddenly on the front page of whatever newspaper you read for an API vulnerability that could have easily been found and mitigated prior to production? So I think that, for any of us in security, it's always better to know and stop a flaw before it goes live. And yet, we also always recognize that there is a lot of friction between what a developer is responsible for, which is often building and publishing, applications and pushing new code and pushing new, new features that provide business value as quickly as possible. And sometimes that, we tend to think of securing those as inherently opposed to the speed with which we want to, push new valuable applications out to market. And I don't think that it's not a zero-sum game, right? The notion of speed and digital transformation and security, there has to be a balance between the two. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the three different pillars of a strong API security strategy and which of those pillars inherently helps us shift our focus to the left. So there's a variation of this that Gartner has also published. We maybe use a little bit different vernacular, in terms of what those three pillars are. But I think that we're talking about fundamentally the same things, which is governance, testing, and monitoring. And of those, it should be apparent that governance and testing can very easily and should live as much to the left or pre-production as possible, and monitoring, equally important, lives in a production environment, right? So we should be making sure that we as security practitioners are working with our development counterparts to create strong governance guidelines and guardrails to help from the very beginning of the design phases of APIs and throughout the API and application lifecycle in what it means to develop secure APIs, right? What are the things that they can do as they're designing and building to make sure that security is inherent in how they're building these APIs. And then from a testing perspective, right? Testing lives throughout the software development lifecycle in terms of and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well, traditional AppSec testing versus API testing and how we can deploy different types of testing at different stages of the lifecycle to make sure that the APIs that we're publishing are as free of flaws as possible without slowing down that speed of development. And then using monitoring, obviously, to make sure that we are still watching for things that are happening in a production state and helping to provide intelligence back into our governance and our testing pillars as well. So briefly, I'll talk a little bit about each one of those pillars, and then I'll dive into more of the specifics around some case studies. On the governance side, really our goals here are, how are we creating consistency, setting expectations, creating those guardrails and the best practices that say, this is how you should be developing and documenting your APIs, and then creating the policies that we can use to then enforce what we've just told them, right? So this is how you should do it, and how are we watching and governing to make sure that you're doing the things that we've asked you to do. And that covers everything from the engineering process all the way down to, are you documenting your APIs the way that they need to be documented? Again, that becomes very important later on down the line in terms of helping to create an environment that is healthy for testing and that is healthy for monitoring. And then what sort of, what style guides can we create? And some of these are specific to different organizations. It should be specific to your organization, to your industry, what those levels of documentation should be, how you handle things like authentication. And I'll talk a little bit about that in how we can arm developers with some best practices and some examples. But really, the other piece of governance is about, what do you have? What does it do? How are you documenting and storing all of these APIs so that you don't have a problem with shadow or rogue APIs, that APIs are only built and deployed in approved ways, that you've always got proper validation. A great way to do this is usually at a gateway or a marketplace, right? If everybody's always having to check their APIs in, that's a perfect opportunity for you to review and flag any improper documentation or improperly built APIs from the get-go. And I think that all of these things, while I know a lot of people are probably shaking their heads saying, yeah, that sounds great, but that's just not realistic. There's hundreds or thousands of APIs at our organization. Who knows where they are? They exist all over the place. Probably true, and that's true for many of our customers. And yet, you don't not protect what you know about. You don't stop to say, if I don't know about everything, then I shouldn't protect anything. Or if other things were built incorrectly or not documented from the beginning, where do we even start? Well, you start today, you start with what you know, and you build from there, right? And I do think this has to be a partnership between the development organization and security, in terms of deciding what those standards are, where things are going to live, how security can leverage some of those API management tools that dev is probably already using to increase our security posture. Threat modeling is something that is a joint process that should be done between development and security organizations. I think there's a lot of education in here that we can bring, that we as security professionals can bring to the development team to help them understand, okay, when you're thinking about, as you build APIs, you can build basic threat models, and we'll help you build basic threat models that can help you think through how an API might be attacked, how your API might be attacked once it's in a live environment. And then in terms of style guides, I talked about this earlier, but really here it's giving them very specific understandings of how they can build and document their APIs in a way that makes them easy to test and secure. So these are just some examples, and we'll make these slides available to everyone. But obviously, these are not generated by us. These are generated by other API management programs that are platforms that are out there. But I think it's helpful to just walk through this and get an understanding between the two of you about what your design guide should look like, and that security should have a role in developing that design guide. It shouldn't exist just on the development side. Making sure that every API is documented is probably the single most important thing that we can do to set ourselves up for the ability to understand and secure those APIs. And I'll just kind of fly through these. So then let's get to the next pillar, the testing pillar, which is, kind of where the rubber meets the road. Okay, let's assume that there are APIs that are well documented and that we can test. Where would we want to test these? Do we want to wait until they're in production, or do we want to test them in pre-production? And the answer is actually probably both for many organizations. But ideally, the more that we can test before production, the better job we're able to do of finding and flagging vulnerabilities, rerouting that intelligence back to development to mitigate those risks without slowing down the speed of development, but also without creating friction in the process. And I think the most important thing there is that when we test pre-production and when we find these flaws early, we are minimizing the amount of technical debt that we end up with as an organization. Because all too often, if we don't find vulnerabilities until they're live, and potentially they've been live for quite some time, the business conversation that then happens that says, okay, now we know this vulnerability exists. What's the risk of this vulnerability being exploited versus the real cost to the organization of going back and fixing this when we have these layers upon layers of technical debt now sitting on top of that risk? And I think we all as security practitioners know that oftentimes security is going to be on the losing side of that equation. So the more often that we can find these vulnerabilities prior to production, the more likely we are able to actually fix those flaws and mitigate our risks. We talk about how we test and what we can do to support both developer testing, and then where do we come in to actually, test APIs as well. And I think I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this because I know that Corey spoke about this yesterday, and that's not really what this conversation is meant to be. But I think that there are some great tools, and I'll hit them in just a second, out on APIsec University for all of those of you who want to learn how to hack your own APIs if you're not already doing it, and how to learn, how to penetration test APIs. We should always be API first testing because that's where attackers are going to attack first. They're going to go the path of least resistance. So when we're thinking about how do we test for our APIs for vulnerabilities, we're looking at 3 different categories around API security, data security, and business logic. And I think that having developers have an understanding of what these different test categories are and why we're testing for them, and how, without necessarily having to become security or testing experts themselves, helps them to think about, if this is what they're testing for, then how am I designing and building my APIs so that these things don't exist, once we get to that test phase. It also, this is something that we found super helpful in terms of how we train development organizations and talk to them about API security. Giving them real world examples and talking to your development teams about, here is the OWASP API top 10, and here are very specific examples. And if you haven't seen those, I'll share some resources with how you can get your hands on those, but helping your developers understand in terms of a real world scenario, this flaw, this vulnerability was used in this exploit. Here's how it was used. Here's how the developer could have mitigated against it. And here's how we could have tested for it to make sure that it didn't exist prior to that application going live and that API making it out into the world. This may be the single most valuable tool that we've found in educating our development counterparts on how to how to think about API security as they're designing APIs. So this is my big plug, my pitch for, if you didn't hear about it in Corey's session last night, there is a free API penetration testing course when we talk about how to hack your own APIs and why you should be doing that. This course will give you everything you need from soup to nuts on penetration testing any API. And there's a free certification that comes with it. It's a great course. Corey's done an amazing job at building not just the content, but the actual flow of the course and the each module and the quizzes that you'll take at the end of each module. So I would encourage you, that we've got over 40,000 people that have already signed up for this course. Go join them over at Apisec University. It's an incredible tool for anyone in the security side of the organization that wants to learn more about how to do this from a practical perspective. So the last pillar I'll go through very quickly, but it's monitoring, right? And so I think I want to make sure that, we give every pillar its due. They all have a role to play in terms of a comprehensive API security strategy and a mature API security program. And I do think that there's a lot of value that monitoring can provide back into, again, that governance and testing loop, right? But the reality is monitoring by default is a reactive or lives right version of API security versus where we can leverage those learnings to bring security further to the left in terms of the life cycle. And the last thing I want to hit on, because I know that a lot of organizations that we come across get stuck here, and that's API discovery. And we are very intentional about saying API governance versus just calling it API discovery, although discovery is a core element of governance. The reality is API discovery, it's not a point in time activity. And all too often, because this is a young market, we see too many security organizations really struggling with this and getting stuck with, but I don't know what my API inventory is. I don't know the full scope of my API infrastructure. So what can I do to test or to harden? I can't move forward with anything until I've documented all of my APIs and I know where they are and where they live and what they do. And you should always be trying to discover as much of those APIs as possible. But it's an ongoing thing, right? And the reality is, for any of us in an enterprise environment of any size organization, your API catalog, your API inventory is very likely not shrinking. So putting off hardening and governing and testing the APIs that you have that exist today, while you're busy trying to discover all of the APIs that you have, is exposing you to bigger, greater risk, probably by orders of magnitude, right? So start with what you know, start today, work with development to try to create some governance guardrails around how you'll do a better job of documenting and discovering APIs moving forward. But don't stop what you're doing, or don't not start just because you're not sure what all of your APIs are that exist out there in the wild. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here, and we've talked about what those three pillars of API security are. How do we start to bridge some of that development security gap that often exists, and the friction that exists when you're talking about where security should live and how much of that burden do developers feel like we're putting on them, even if that's not necessarily the case. Will they feel burdened or will they feel empowered? And I think a big part of that lies in education on both sides. I think I mentioned this up front, right? But I think that there's an educational component around helping developers better understand and appreciate what it means to have to test and harden and secure and monitor an API. And at the same time, helping, especially through courses like Corey's course, helping those of us in the security profession better understand how our APIs constructed in the first place, right? How are they designed? How are they built? How are they developed so that we can better understand how to empower developers to develop those APIs securely from the beginning. So I think that there's education that goes both ways in terms of us better understanding APIs and developers better understanding how we have to go about securing those APIs. And I think that, one of the things for developers when we talk about educating them, there's actually a great opportunity that we have on the security side in the terms of, in the form of regulatory compliance. There are a lot of regulations out there that actually mandate annual developer training around security and API security specifically. So this is an opportunity for us to open a conversation with them and to start to talk about what is the OWASP API Top 10, to help them understand what that is, to help them understand best practices around, designing secure APIs from the ground up. I'm going to jump forward. We actually have a course that's coming in the next couple of weeks to Apisec University. It's our API Security Fundamentals course. This is really built for both developers or anyone else in the organization that needs to know the fundamentals about API security. So we'll go through those 3 pillars, what they mean to different teams in the organization. We break down the entire OWASP API Top 10 with those very specific examples so that the developers can understand how real world breaches occurred, leveraging those vulnerabilities. So this will launch in the next 2 weeks, but I will say, the course materials are actually already there, and we have had the opportunity, Apisec University has had the opportunity to train over 1,000 developers. I know that's a drop in the bucket when it comes to the 22 million that I talked about earlier, but we'll chip away at it over time. But I think that it's really been exciting to partner with development organizations to bring this API security fundamentals training to them and to get some real world feedback early on what developers need to be successful in partnering with their security counterparts. So if you're in Apisec University already, you'll get a notification about this once it goes live. If you're not, I would encourage you to go out there and sign up and make sure that you're one of the first to find out and be an advocate of this for your organization. It's not as intensive or a deep dive as the penetration testing course is. So you should be able to complete this course in under 2 hours. But it's a great baseline understanding that every developer and really every application business owner should have of API security. In that, we break down the OWASP Top 10. So I think that just helping organizations and people who live outside of our security world and realm understand that there is a specific API Top 10 within the OWASP that is different from application vulnerabilities goes a long way to just creating kind of a common vernacular and a common understanding of how we work together to develop strong secure APIs. And one of the other things that we talk through in the course is we help developers and the organization at large understand where API security fits in terms of a traditional cybersecurity landscape, right? And I think the great news is, from an application or an AppSec perspective, there are a lot of paradigms that already exist around testing that we can leverage to help us integrate API security testing into that software development lifecycle, because they're already doing it in many cases and they're already tooled for it. Now, the challenge comes in helping them understand what the limitations are of some of those existing, of STA or SAST or DAST or IAST, what those do well, and then what are their limitations when it comes to API testing, and how do we augment those limitations. But I think that trying to weave what we're trying to accomplish with shifting left with API security as much into the existing paradigms that developers are leveraging will help us to be more successful. And we've seen that, right? The more that we can integrate both into their processes and their technologies is really important, because oftentimes that process and people side of the change is going to be far more challenging, but also far more valuable in the end than just the technology integration piece. That's the easy one. The harder one is for sure the process. So helping them understand, here's what we're doing today from an application security testing perspective. And then again, what are those gaps, right? So here's how we test apps typically, and then here's where that doesn't extend to API security, right? That those don't usually look at what's actually exploitable, and specifically the most exploited aspect, business logic, the hardest to test for, right? Having them have an understanding of what that is and how to design APIs that are less vulnerable to those business logic attacks will go a long way to helping secure and harden APIs. Here really what we're talking about is where we test for different things within their existing software development life cycle and how we test for it, right? So what are the tools that we're using? What are we testing for? How are we testing for? Does that exist to test the application or the API or both? And where do we best test for API security? So while we do, some code scanning and the software composition analysis early in the software development lifecycle, really having them have an understanding of the fact that API security testing needs to happen, at that deployment stage, I think is really helpful. And in the end, it's just about, right, how do we shift left with our testing as much as possible so that we find different elements as early as possible, again, mitigating those and reducing the amount of technical debt that we have at each stage when something new is found. And then automate as much of it as possible, right? So I think that the sheer volume of APIs is staggering when you think of what needs to be tested. And I think that can also become a little bit of a barrier or a prohibitor, not a little bit, a huge barrier to testing production, right? So if the feeling is that all of these tests have to be written or scripted by a person and it's not reusable, that's just not possible when you're talking about the scope of APIs, right? So automating as much of this as possible is important. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about a few real world examples, and then we will transition and open it up to questions in about 5-10 minutes here. So I'm going to give you just a couple of our deployments where we've actually seen a lot of success early on. And again, I mentioned it's different size organizations, right? So some of these organizations are, less than 500 people. We've got organizations that have outside, third-party development teams. So they actually don't even own any of the development lifecycle, and those development teams are using third-party APIs. So I think that it doesn't really matter what your development organization looks like or the size of your organization. You can start somewhere and find success with a shift left API security model. So this first example, this actually happens to be a very large financial institution. They've got hundreds of different applications, which is not unusual for a financial institution, right? Some of those applications are legacy, some of them are fairly new. They've been built in-house, some of them have been bought or acquired through acquisitions. They are moving towards more of a microservices architecture approach, as with any large financial institution. So in that, they have hundreds, if not thousands, of APIs. Again, those are internal and external. Some of them, a lot of them, are third-party APIs. And this organization, as with many, is leveraging multiple different API gateways. We have just, the one that's called out here, but many organizations are leveraging more than one API gateway, API management tool, and that's fine, right? You can exist in one or in many. So I think the big lesson here for us was, and I mentioned it earlier on, right? You don't wait. They didn't wait to catalog every single API. What they did was they started with what they know and what are high value targets, right? So how do we get in front of and prove out an automation and a shift left model, or I should say a shift left security model that leverages automation and machine learning to help us to test and harden all of our APIs before they go to production. And they started with what they knew and what they could do to prove out the model, and then they'll expand, right? So now they're expanding to hundreds of additional APIs, additional API gateways. But my recommendation and our recommendation would be, start with what you know, start with something that is achievable and that you can find success with, because that people and process piece is going to be your biggest hurdle, not the integrations with the technology. So in this organization, right, these are apps that sit in front of sensitive PCI and PII data. They're obviously built to move and manage money. So really finding and mitigating those critical vulnerabilities before, or exploitable vulnerabilities before they go live is critical for them. So what we do here is we integrate with their gateway. Anytime an API is added, modified, refreshed, we can pull down the latest definition of what that API is. We analyze the endpoints to figure out, what is this API capable of, and custom generate thousands of API specific attack playbooks that are, based on those endpoints. And it covers all of the major attack types, everything in the OWASP top 10 and hundreds of others that are in kind of our security categories. And then truly within seconds or minutes, depending upon the API, the API has been analyzed, those tests have been generated and executed, and then a risk score is assigned. So the way that this organization set it up is, it's a pass-fail. And that was a partnership between the business and development side of the organization and security to say what is a critical vulnerability that would stop a build and reroute it, and what would we let through even while it's being mitigated. So all of this is automated. If it stops, it creates a JIRA ticket, sends the log files of the test with remediation insights back to the developer so that they can quickly address those vulnerabilities and reintroduce their API, check it back in for another round of testing. It's been extremely successful here, to the point, where, as I mentioned, they're now expanding to several other gateways and opening it up to several hundred additional APIs beyond, the hundreds that they're already running through this process every day. Again, I think the big finding here is start with what you know. Find a specific environment that you can be successful in, and that also, by the way, has helped them to develop some of those governance guardrails that then they can introduce at the API gateway level. So at the MuleSoft level, now they can also and are also looking at the documentation that gets loaded up with those APIs, and is it the proper documentation? Are they using the right authentication schemas? So I think that there's a lot of value in, in what they learned at that organization. This next example is, it happens to be a very, very large telecom operator. And I know that there have been a few of those in the news of late. This is not them, for vulnerabilities and exploitable weaknesses. This one, same thing. They've got a microservices architecture. They're leveraging both Postman and GitHub, as well as API Marketplace in the form of Kong. And here they've got multiple different distributed development teams. They build and release microservices at their own pace. So there's no kind of common core development lifecycle. It's just ad hoc at will. And they publish each of those releases to an internal marketplace, as well as pushing them out to production. So before APIsec, the developers would check their code into a GitHub repo, and they'd use Postman to create those functional tests. They'd apply basic security scans, and that's where they stored their API documentation. Then they'd use GitHub Actions to publish to the API Marketplace, which is Kong, where they're available for use in production. So at that point, their AppSec team was only able to penetration test once a year, which meant that there was an entire year for undetected security issues to exist, which of course means probably several layers of tech debt that pile up on top of that. So really their goal with their, at the outset was to mature that DevSecOps approach, and to be able to penetration test APIs with every single deployment in a continuous delivery model. So, there's a big business question that comes into play when they're trying to execute this, right? Do we fix what's, what we found, and what's the impact to the speed of development or to revenue, or do we accept the risk that that exists with this vulnerability? And again, I think that's those trade-offs have to be a joint discussion between security and the business side of the house, right? What is an exploitable vulnerability that the organization specifically believes is a critical risk and that will stop a build? So with APIsec as part of their deployment pipeline, GitHub Actions will invoke APIsec. APIsec will pull down the applicable APIs from Postman. It analyzes them, same as the last case study, where it'll generate thousands of API-specific plays against all the OWASP and other security categories as defined by this organization themselves. It takes seconds to minutes to generate those attacks and execute them. APIsec will give the score. If there's no critical vulnerabilities, it's approved and pushes out to their API Marketplace Kong. If it has critical vulnerabilities, same, it goes. They're also using Jira, although any ticketing system can be integrated, but they're using Jira so that they can route it back to the developer to fix. I think that this is a similar example of a microservices architecture, but what's unique here is really using some of those other technologies that will invoke the testing at different stages of the development lifecycle. And I'll leave you with, so there we go, sorry. One last example. This is a much smaller organization, but they have a continuous deployment model. And this organization is a healthcare organization. They are pushing new code on a daily, if not hourly basis. So they are a very small team. And as with any organization, I didn't mention it in the other two, but the other two are larger organizations where developers outnumber their security professionals by probably hundreds to one. And this organization is similar, right? Their developers they've got hundreds of developers, nowhere near that many application security professionals. So trying to have AppSec teams design, write, and run pen tests against builds that are pushing on an hourly basis is just, it's not realistic, right? So again, what they were relegated to was running those tests at point in time, typically through a third-party pen test firm, and feeling very uncomfortable about how much time would exist between when those tests were run, if they were even testing their APIs, and when they would get results back and be able to effectively fix any of those vulnerabilities. This one's a little bit unique because they actually started in a production environment so that they could get confident and comfortable with what the security findings were and know that they weren't finding, that it wasn't a noisy system, that they weren't flagging a lot of false positives, and unnecessarily slowing down the speed of production, which interestingly enough actually only took a couple of weeks before they said, this is amazing. It's, what we've done is move it to a pre-production environment, because they're confident in the accuracy of the tests and in the scores, and have kind of fine-tuned what those security categories are based on their business model and based on their applications. So similar to the others, they've got an API gateway. Everything goes into the API gateway. Apisec pulls it down, tests, gives it a score, and then either it's rerouted or it goes into a live production environment. And I believe this one's actually, they're still testing both in production and in pre-production, just as sort of a fail-safe, right? And I think that may be true of a lot of organizations where they want to run continuous testing in both production and pre-production, especially if you're leveraging third-party APIs. So with that, I'm just going to leave you with some best practices, and then we'll open it up for questions. So on the best practice side, we talked a lot about governance. I think that enforcing API governance, creating that sort of central API control, whether it's a gateway, a marketplace platform, API management tool, the notion here is that no API is able to go live without passing certain phase gates, both at the documentation level, at the testing level, right? Functional testing as well as security testing. The comprehensiveness of your testing program is really important. So, making sure that you're testing every single endpoint across all of those OWASP attack types, evaluating all of the different data objects, what are the user types and functions, what logic flaws might exist, and then, leveraging automation whenever and wherever possible to get that broadest, most comprehensive, not just broad, but depth as well. So the breadth and depth of testing that you need to really create comprehensive test coverage. In order to do that, it needs to be automated and continuous, right? Testing should match the pace of development. And even though those APIs don't necessarily always change or can rarely change, the code around those APIs and leveraging those APIs does. So the logic changes, the infrastructure changes, and every single release needs both functional and security testing, because any of those changes can create security vulnerabilities even in an API that was previously unchanged. And the more, I talked about it, but the more that we integrate those testing capabilities into existing CI/CD pipelines, the less friction we create, and the more likely we are to be successful, in the long run. And then finally, develop the right metrics around assessing where did you start, what progress have you made, how many APIs are under management, how many vulnerabilities have been identified, how many are outstanding, how many are fixed. And really, I think with those just kind of 4 broad best practices, we have seen very strong partnerships start to emerge between the development and AppSec organizations across every different size enterprise, right? From the tens of thousands to, to the hundreds of employees. And I think that, it's been really encouraging to see that there is a way to achieve shift left security without everybody having that very visceral reaction that maybe past failures have brought about. So as I mentioned, that API fundamentals course is coming soon. I would encourage all of you who feel like banging your heads against the wall sometimes inside of your own organizations when it comes to evangelizing API security and talking to your teams outside of security about why it's so important. I would encourage all of you to push, as many of your peers to take that fundamentals course. Again, it's less than a 2-hour time commit, and I think everybody can take away value from it in terms of understanding how APIs are exploited and how we can better secure and harden them prior to them going into production. That's it for my talk.
Awesome.
Great. There you are, Mel.
Christine. Fantastic presentation. A lot of it was music to my ears. I was like, yay, like we're talking about full inventory of APIs and standardization. And, I love all the points of, the people process being the biggest challenge, because it's easy to say it out loud, like, oh yeah, this is what you need to do, but actually incorporating that to your governance and and making sure all these different teams are interacting. It becomes quite challenging, because you have the development team, then you have the security team, then you have the network team, and making sure that we're not impacting operations in the process can also be challenging too, right? So we have some time to go over some Q&A. Looking at the comments quickly here, I jotted down some questions. I wanted to talk about a little bit on the testing validation piece. So obviously there's a lot of different tools you can use, but what is the best methodology to have that cadence, like in specifically timeframes, right? So and we're talking in the pre-production process. So
Sure.
if we're getting ready to deploy an API, right? That obviously there's testing, there's a lot of time and effort to go into it, but then you go into post and APIs live, how often do we have to test and validate those APIs?
So I think I mentioned, we do have customers who are testing in a production environment. They're still running testing there. There it becomes, very much a security practice versus more of that, kind of shift left dev practice. And they're interpreting and determining what would indicate that there's an issue that they need to take back and bring to developers. But I think that from a pre-production perspective, really what we've seen is that the best practice is to get as close to real time testing every single build, testing all of the APIs with every build every single time something has changed, right? So it's just that last check that validates all of the APIs before anything goes to production. And I think that the reality of making that happen comes down to having that strong agreement between sec and dev that says, here's what would stop a build, right? Here's what we would define as a critical vulnerability, knowing that you are testing for the right security categories, and that I think it takes most organizations a couple of tries, and maybe you test certain tiers of security categories first in that automated all the way through, always on continuous testing cycle before you start to get comfortable with, okay, we know that there are very few, if any, false positives or false negatives, and that both sides are confident in security being able to match the pace of dev without slowing things down that are noisy, right? That are not valid. So I guess, ideally, you're always continuously testing every single build, but I think the reality is getting there is usually a process that says, like, let's let's make sure that we're doing it in stages that everybody's comfortable and confident with, because the reality is I think both sides have probably been burned in the past with noisy systems.
Sure.
So it's
Yeah.
building that trust that says, yeah, we trust the validity of the tests, and we trust that it can, that it can keep pace with the speed of development without slowing us down unnecessarily.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, and just to expand on that, look, from an operator perspective, because sometimes in the API realm, developer realm, not all teams are aware that there's something in development underway, right? So they might be lifting all these APIs and going live, and all of a sudden, you have a SOC team sitting behind a SIM, and they're getting all these different detections from APIs, right? Or they're using a platform that monitors APIs, and they're like, "What's this?" So I think the message I heard you say was people in process is maybe integrating them possibly into a change of control board, right? To ensure that they're part of that change, right? Although it might be labor intensive and it might take a little bit longer on the deployment go live stage, I think being able to say we've done the checks and balances and make someone accountable to ensure that all of these are going live correctly.
Yes. No, I think that actually makes a lot of sense. And I think that is a process as well, right? It's not going to happen with every single API at once. And that may be where, sometimes you start with a specific subset of your APIs, or a specific group that says like, okay, let's start here, harden the process, and then expand from there, which is often going to be the case anywhere, right? Is how do you harden the process first, and then go bigger? Because that's where we often fail, right? Is we try to get too big or try to automate too much too fast.
Right. Or meeting a timeline, right? Meeting a go live timeline, which is that's usually where the mistakes happen, is like, oh, we have to go live no matter what. Push it through, we'll fix it later. But then no one's really capturing those findings.
And we all know what fix it later really equates to in the real world, right?
So moving on to another great section of your presentation was third parties, right? We have internal APIs, and then I can think of many organizations that use third party aggregators, for example, and financial systems that share certain types of APIs across the board, rinse, wash, and repeat. So what are some recommendations if they have this, and how can they test, or how can they validate that the APIs are secure through a third party?
So an example of an organization that we work with that has this business model, right? So it's a financial institution, and as with many of the kind of regional financial institutions, maybe not the behemoths, but the middle layer, they heavily leverage third-party developers and third-party APIs, right? So most of them don't even have their own large development teams in-house.
Right.
And actually, it's not just financial institutions, right? Lots of businesses do this, where your mobile or your web apps are built by a third-party dev shop. That third-party dev shop may be building their own APIs, they may be using third-party APIs, but what those organizations have done is actually implemented this. And in that case, in some ways, they're better leveraged to do it than maybe an organization that has its own. I mean, truly, hopefully, right? That you can say, we won't accept any build, or that everything has to pass through this phase gate, and we can apply stricter security controls to it. I think the challenge there is the do you want to continue to run in production? And again, like monitoring, while this talk was about shift left, the notion of monitoring in real time, or testing in real time as well, doing those things in production, just as a validation that things aren't changing, that you're not seeing, that's code checked in by your development team. With those third-party APIs, right? Because the truth is, you don't really have, other than their assertion to you that they've done this, you don't have any level of validation on your own that says, yes, they've done this, and they've hardened these APIs, and they are testing every build before it goes live. And the reality, as we all know, is that they're not, right? And where I think you will see that, or we are seeing that play out first, is in the notion of cybersecurity insurance and risk, right? So you see them pushing the risk downstream. The insurers saying, we won't insure you unless you can prove that all of your third-party providers, that all of your, your business partners have done these things, and that you have, that you've vetted them, and that you've tested them, and that you've monitored them. And then what the organizations do is say, you have to do this, you have to prove this to us, and you have to have cybersecurity insurance risk, because if we get breached,
Right.
we're going to push it down to you, and your insurance is going to pay. So it's kind of funny that in the absence of doing the right thing, people are like, to use a colloquialism, like the shift, it rolls downhill. So I think that the savvier organizations are putting controls in place that say, we don't trust, we will always verify, right? Similar to a zero trust security model, right? That prove to us that you've done this and that you're continuing to do it on a continuous basis. And we will also run our own level of testing to validate those findings and to make sure that we're confident that it's been tested and hardened. But in the absence of that, it's money. And who's going to pay
exactly
when there's a breach?
Exactly. No, all great points. And in a perfect world, if we can make them accountable and have some type of accreditation or, stamp of approval saying we are protected, leveraging the OWASP vulnerability top 10, and we're all secure from these vulnerabilities, that would be ideal. But
it's interesting that
you
say that, because because that's a conversation though that we have on and the regulatory side always takes forever to catch up, but it is, right? Like what does PCI mean when it comes to APIs? What do those certifications mean? And are you just checking a box, or are you actually securing the thing that you're saying you're securing?
Well, it's funny you say that, because the way I think of it when I talk about security and compliance is compliance, is a checkbox, right? And you have security, which is, to me, in my mind, the way I translate it is security keeps you out of jail and compliance keeps you from getting fired. So,
well,
you want to think
it's
of it that way.
You say that, now with some of the last 6 months, recent personal liability being introduced into the market, that is jail time. That's actually probably
we're being held accountable for it, for sure.
Yeah, it's a healthy way to look at it.
So one last question. I know we're running a little bit over, but this is so, I'm a protection practitioner myself. And one important thing to me is monitoring APIs, right? And really uncovering anomalies and active attacks. What are some really good, you mentioned brute force attacks in one of your slides. What are some other really good signals? Is it like, a web server error code that we see across a SIM solution that kind of you can put A and B together to get C? What are some other good detections or signals that the operations teams can leverage when they're monitoring APIs for any type of malicious adversarial attack?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And monitoring is definitely not my forte, but I would say yes, for sure, any anomalous behavior, watching for, I think that the other things that we can do is, simulate what are the attacks that we would run and watch for that type of behavior in a monitoring environment, right? So there's a very symbiotic relationship that says testing should get better based on what we see happening in a real-time environment, and a real-time environment should be watching for the things that hackers are testing for, right? So that white hat hackers, that bug bounty hackers are testing for, and have that kind of continuous feedback loop that says, we're watching for all of these things and we're testing for all of these things. And when something occurs that's new on both sides, and I do think that a lot of the API security platforms, this is kind of what they preach, right? That is that one informs the other, and informs the other, and it becomes more of that infinity loop of
Sure.
intelligence versus being separated, right? So I think that
Right.
no matter what tools you're using for each of those pillars of API security, there should be good cross-functional, I guess, or cross-pillar communications between all three of those, whether it's all with one security platform or in reality it's many, right? That intelligence is being shared amongst them so that we're getting smarter on both sides.
Perfect. Well said. Love it. Thank you so much, Christine. I'll leave you with the final closing thoughts to our audience. Any last words?
Really, my only last word is go sign up for APIsec University. I don't have any skin in that game, but I just,
I just signed up myself.
I've just seen so much value come from that in terms of both our depth and breadth of testing and the community's ability to educate each other. Not the least of which is the Discord channel that goes with that. There's some really amazing conversations that happen in that channel with people supporting each other and just in their growth in API security and learning how to do this. So share it, sign up for it if you haven't done it. And while not everybody wants to become a certified API security pen tester, there'll be lots of other great content out there for you to leverage and lots of tools too. There's a whole resource section out there.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, Christine. It was lovely having you.
Thank you. I
Present the
appreciate it.
2023 API Secure.